Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Yanni Kotsonis. I'm director of the Jordan Center. I'm a historian of Russia. We try at the Jordan Center, we're a new institution, but we try to actually bring together things that usually do not come together. And in this case, we're talking about disciplines and fields evolving around a particular topic, which is race. And what's particularly good about the way that David has conceived of, David Rainbow, our organizer, the way he conceived of the project is that it would not be a conversation about whether race works in Russia, but the question of how it works, which I think is a good way to move the conversation forward, because the conversation has not been moving forward. But I think what's astute about the way he put it together also is that he's mixing the disciplines in very nice ways, in ways that we all find here attractive. It's part of our mission, I think, in the departments and in the center. And the other thing that he's done is he's insisted that it has to be a conversation among the fields as well, which is to say that Russian specialists now moving into the area of race need to be aware that they're not inventing the wheel, that there's a lot of literature in other fields, and to try to understand not so much whether, for example, the so-called classic American example of race, or the German classical example of race, works in Russia, because the answer will always be no, but to recognize the fact that the American and the German cases are exceptional, and that the rest of the world was involved in all sorts of conversations that are not about American and German race. So working from the ground up, from the Russian field, because we do have that obligation, we're nevertheless working our way outward to be involved in a larger conversation. David, I think, has done a wonderful job in thinking this through about how it would be done. David is going to tell you also about how we're going to proceed, but it's not going to be the kind of thing we're going to have long introductions and CVs and so on. We're just going to go directly into the conversation. You're going to get names, and if you want to know more about them, you look at the program or Google it. So it's going to be very much a conference in motion. David, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah. I'm thrilled to see all of you here. Thank you so much for coming and being a part. Some of you have traveled from very far, and some not so far. Please come on. So yeah, the workshop is, as the participants and the discussants already have been thinking about, is an opportunity to come together and sort of think about what race has meant in Russian history and how it's been practiced in an explicitly comparative context, which is why we have structured it so that our participants from outside the Russian field get the first crack at these papers, to critique, to discuss, to react, and they have the floor and get the kind of first chance to set the stage for how it is we're going to talk about race. Certainly there are a lot of questions and problems that are specific to the Russian field, and I'm sure that will be a part of the conversation too. But the hope is that we're constantly going to be feeling the tension of not being able to dive down deeper and deeper and deeper into the specifics of the Russian case, which are essential and important, but to try to extract from those specifics the conceptual significance of the topic. And that's going to be done by having to talk about this in a cross-field way. As you'll see, several of the papers that we're going to be discussing explain in great detail some of the reasons why this conversation hasn't happened, or is just beginning to happen, right? That it's been difficult to analyze and locate race in the Russian context, and we'll have a lot of material for thinking about why that was the case. Suffice it to say, for now, that the concepts and the categories that get used for understanding human difference, nationality, ethnicity, race, are complicated and work in Russia in different ways, and in overlapping ways, and in inconsistent ways, and in seemingly mutually exclusive ways that we're going to be talking about. So I just wanted to give a for instance of that. So the first time that I encountered this complexity firsthand was in 2010 when I was living in Tolz, Siberia. I had the great honor and privilege of being counted in the Russian census. The Russian census taker came to my apartment and knocked on the door, and said she wanted to count me. So I said, "Okay, count." But she explained she needed to come in and sit at my kitchen table. So we sat, and she began to ask me questions. And when we got to the question about nationality, which in Russian was nationalная принадлежность, so national belonging. What nationality do you belong to, she asked. And I said, I'm an American. She put down her pencil and kind of looked at me askance and said, you probably meant to say German. And I said, I kind of looked around. I thought maybe I wasn't alone. But I said, no, I'm pretty sure I meant to say American. Still unconvinced, she offered another option. Italianets. Italian. No, American. Now, I knew right away what was happening. So nationality, nationalnost, which is not a Russian word, has, in Russian, has more than simply nationality. She was saying, don't tell me your citizenship. Tell me your ethnicity, your race, your sort of the people you come from. And so American was not a sufficient answer. So this, it seems to me, needs explanation. Why was it that this Siberian census taker knew that I was German when I didn't even know? Right? We need to explain this. So a little while later, after the census results were published, I looked them up to find out if indeed American was a valid nationality, and it was. I was happy to find out. The Census Bureau was kind enough to publish a list of, it said, suggested nationalities. So these were not prescriptive in a strict legal sense. You could pick whatever you want, because unlike in the US where you have to tick a box, in Russia it's a blank, and you get to, it's self-described. And so Amerikanets was one of them. So was Afro-Amerikanets, so was Afro, so was African Russian, so was Little Russian, and a number of others. And I was shocked to find that it wasn't simply one single-spaced page delineating all of the possible nationalities you could be. It wasn't 2 pages. It wasn't 10. It was 36 pages of single-spaced 10-point font possible nationalities that one might find in the Russian Federation. So this too seems to need explanation, it seems to me. Why is it that there are 1,860 numbered possible nationalities that one can be in Russia, in the Russian Federation today? But this seems to me distinctly different than our 8.5 boxes that we can check for race, which is ostensibly very clearly defined and everybody's supposed to know what they are. So this is part of what we're trying to explain. Why is it that nationality, race, ethnicity, modes of naming human difference are different in Russia than they are elsewhere? Of course it's exceptional, but every place is exceptional, right? So the question is not to try to hold up Russian race against some predetermined norm, but to try to understand how it is interacting in this complex way and how it's changed over time. So that's my story. A few words about how we're going to proceed. Each panel, we're going to have 3 panels a day, today and tomorrow. Each panel is divided into 2 papers which have been pre-circulated among the participants, given by scholars of Russia. The discussant, who's coming from outside the Russian field, from Germany, France, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the US, will then have, as I said, the first crack at responding to this from the perspective of their field, right? So there are no apologies needed that these are not experts in Russian history, although in some cases they are. But the point is, how are you going to react and respond to the way that we in the Russian field are beginning to treat this category, and tell us what works, what doesn't work, ask questions. And so we're really looking forward to those comments. Then after 15 minutes, so the presenters will have 5 minutes apiece, the discussant will have about 10 minutes, and then it's going to be open for questions to the general population. And we will have 2 hours to discuss this, so we look forward to your comments and your responses, and we look forward to the presentations. The last thing I'll do is simply ask the presenters to say their name and to say where they're coming from, just so that we have some names and faces. And I'm sorry?
Nationalis?
What else? Yes, it's nationality or, yeah, self-ascribed nationality. Yeah, so without further ado, we'll start with you, Jamie, and then we'll just proceed.
I'm Jamie Phillips. I'm a PhD student here in modern European history, and I'm just a panel chair, so you can read much about me and where it comes from.
And I'm David Rainbow, and I'm a postdoc at Columbia Harriman Institute this year.
Yeah, Herrick Chapman. I'm a history faculty here at NYU, and I'm a French history specialist.
I'm here at NYU in the anthropology department.
Karl, history department at the European University in Budapest.
Vera, Manchester University.
I'm Eric White. I'm at the City College of New York. I'm a historian of Germany and international human rights and other things.
Susanna Lim, Russian literature at the University of Oregon.
Gunjan Sengupta, Brooklyn College and Graduate Center, City University of New York, US. I'm a US specialist. I'm Indian American. I'm not sure whether that's Asian or not.
I'm Yanni Kotsonis. I'm a historian of Russia at NYU. David?
Other workshop.
Yeah, okay. Other workshop participants, just please raise your hand and you can.
Edita Boyanovska, Russian literature, Rutgers University.
Elena Lemon, anthropology, University of Michigan.
Marina Mugelner, University of Illinois and Chicago, and the Russian citizen, so I don't know about Michigan.
Nathaniel Knight, Department of History at Seton University.
Anne Lounsbury, Russian literature, NYU.
I'm Annika Wagner, Washington University in St. Louis, originally from
Jane Sue, I'm from Portland State University.
Adrian Edgar from University of California, Santa Barbara, I'm a historian of Russia and Central Asia.
Aisha Khan, Department of Anthropology, the Caribbean is Outlier.
Jane Burbank, Russian history, NYU, Slavic Department of History.
I think that's everybody for now. There will be a few people trickling in who aren't yet here, but thank you very much. And without further ado, please, Karl Hall and Vera Tolz.
All right. For present purposes, perhaps I'm Estonian, or at least in my student days when I first lived and traveled in Russia, that was, with my stiff accent, that was sometimes the first assumption of where I must be from, although in fact I have no Baltic connection. But nonetheless, the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, and I should explain that I'm something of an interloper here. I'm not a historian of the life sciences, although I am rather unfortunately the only quasi-historian of science in the workshop here, and I take that as kind of an issue for discussion. So I am kind of an interloper because I think of myself more as a historian of the physical sciences and came to this for rather accidental reasons. But hence my anecdote. The physicist Wolfgang Pauli would sometimes write very lengthy letters to some of his correspondents like Werner Heisenberg, and he would sometimes apologize, saying that he did not have enough time to put things briefly. And there's a serious structural problem with the paper that I've submitted. I apologize to all of you for subjecting you to an overly long paper. This partly comes from the genesis of the paper itself. There is a long Russian version of another sort. And the only reason I sort of circle back to this subject matter is because David pleaded with me very eloquently that I should try to disaggregate this overlong paper and just work on the pre-Darwinian problem, which I did with this paper here, but there was clearly a scaling problem. It continued to magnify in scope. And so you have in your hands something that opens up many avenues of discussion, but never quite ties them off properly. So with that acknowledgement, I nonetheless would like you to consider the possibility that race discourses, notions of race, are in fact widely available, if not widely utilized, from the late 18th century. Now, as I argue at length in the paper, this has little to do with the neologism rasa, right, which we usually focus on. The words that are being employed in the late 18th century or the 19th century, well up until the Darwinian debates get underway in the 1860s, are paroda, which also means, well, in the same early modern English sense of breeding stock, right, as well as race, okay? And also plemię, which is more frequently understood as tribe, okay? And it's the intercalation of these usages that we try to track here, which I've tried to give many instantiations of, coming from natural history, from history as such, from anatomy and physiology, geography, from a very glancing way some ethnographic concerns, but not in a responsible fashion, obviously. And just a gesture towards comparative philology. And that is, I consider, a really outstanding problem here, is why comparative philology plays the non-role that it does here. So I'm still puzzling over that, although there are some connections to be made. One of the, I think, underlying themes that clearly is motivating my paper here is a certain desire for us not to see the pre-Darwinian discourses of race as through the eyes of Franz Boas, right? There's no nature-culture distinction that is firmly in place for the period that I'm considering here. And in fact, that's part of the interest of the race concept, is that we can use it to interrogate how clean distinctions between nature and culture get put into place. And that's particularly interesting in the Russian case, precisely because, and here I'll just sort of flag the much later debate that Professor Weitz has been involved in with Franz Hirsch and so forth, precisely because culture has been rendered in such hard forms so frequently in Russian history. And that's part of what we want to try to track here. So I'm trying to proceed somehow without assuming a strong nature-culture divide. I don't know that I'm fully consistent about that. Sometimes I sort of step into the present day and use our own present, analytic categories. I'm not fully historicist, what have you. But that's what I'm trying to press us to look towards here. There's not popular. There's a recently trendy academic term, at least, or thrust, at least within the history of science, history and philosophy of science, which I did not at all invoke in this paper, but strikes me as perhaps relevant here. That's historical epistemology, right? Where we have to unpack how some of these categories are rendered critical. And I think that we do sometimes tend, especially with the case of race, to take our present analytic categories and ask whether or not a past usage of paroda or plemię or rasa conforms to this slot, or that slot, when we have to be more conscious of the historicization of epistemic spaces themselves. So I take that to be a major thrust of the paper. So when we talk about, I think one of the frustrations that might come through from your reading of the paper is that when we talk about plemię or paroda here and there and say, oh, this muddies the understanding of rasa. No, when we're talking about plemię and paroda, we're talking about rasa, full stop, okay? So this is what motivates me in part. And I'll just leave it at that so we can get on to the discussion.
Vera.
Yeah, my paper is actually a little bit of a stream of thought rather than a sort of properly thought through argument. But just to summarize briefly a few points I'm trying to make, similarly to Karl and other speakers at this workshop, what I'm arguing is that when we want to see how what role race performed in Russia, we have to actually look at specific usages at specific time and place. I think Yanni also makes the same point. And what we see in the imperial periods, 19th and early 20th century, and particularly throughout the entire 19th century, it's a complete terminological disarray. And here actually I agree with Karl that very often pre-1860 the word paroda and plemię actually mean rasa. And you have to really read specifically each particular text. And you can't generalize it really within one. Each source has to be read as if it's a kind of something in ancient Greek or Latin, which that was traded, and where you sort of analyze the word usage in a very particular context, in an individual sentence. But at the same time, and we can't sort of extrapolate our current perception of what race means onto this earlier material. So if we generalize about the 19th century overall, what we can see that in the Russian tradition, indeed, culture and nature, culture and biology are perceived to be very closely intertwined. But at the same time, over and over again, our authors say that the actual nature of the link is unclear, and our level of kind of scientific knowledge is insufficient to pinpoint this link. And also, race, in fact, both paroda, pleme, and rasa in the imperial period does not have to be used, as Marina's work shows very well, in order to create hierarchies, doesn't necessarily. But at the same time, the words culture and civilization can be used very much to create hierarchies. So again, to generalize, we can say that most our the authors in the imperial period in Russia, they perceive the world in very hierarchical terms, with Europeans at the top. And that's sort of assumed, and couldn't, to be honest, very difficult to imagine otherwise in the kind of this pan-European context. And with black people at the bottom of the civilizational ladder, and this is repeated over and over again. And then in my paper, I look at other concepts which are used more often than race to account for human diversity, and that's народность and nationalность. And again, when you reread the material, a very familiar one, Nadezhdin's work, early and late Slavophiles, some famous historians, you can actually suddenly sort of see how much they emphasize that народность and nationalность are not separated clearly from paroda or later rasa. And they actually, Nadezhdin says very, very clearly that народность and paroda are not the same, yet they are closely linked. And parodная is present in народная, so the racial is present in the national. Yet again, arguing that the link is not entirely easy to pinpoint. And then, in connection with the fact that we have a terminological disarray, we have this perception of a close link between biology and culture, and as Karl already said, culture is rendered in a kind of very fixed, hard sort of way. How do we look, for instance, at ethnic cleansings which were carried out by the imperial government in the North Caucasus or later on in Central Asia, which, for instance, Conquest discusses in his very well-known article. And it seems that, to me that you have to take into account that this military statisticians whom he cites, or even military analysts, they do not necessarily think that the characteristics which they ascribe to various groups, which they identify, are just stereotypes and prejudices, as Holquist calls them. They think that's part of the national character, and national character for them is a scientific term. And that's, again, is a very important point for us to remember and understand why then these people think that it's scientifically basically proven that all members of a particular group behave in a certain way. It's their national character in a way predetermines that, and that's why you have to target children, or you have to target people who haven't shown any resistance to the Russian rule. It's because you can predict this their behavior through scientifically studying their national characters.
I want to thank David for inviting me. I know the premise is that the non-Russian specialist is supposed to contribute, but I've experienced this completely opposite. This is just looking at this book that I didn't like about, and it's changing the way I think about France. So the sooner the race conversation enters into the larger historical conversation, it's better for everybody. So having said that, let me start with a very broad historiographical observation. I gather the exploration of the race concept in Russia, and I went back and read the White's Rush, etc., debate, which was very illuminating. So I gather the exploration of race as a concept in the Russian past, of racial prejudice, of racializing in general, has come late to Russian history, and it has in French history as well. In that respect, there's a kind of kinship here that has, I think, some interesting intellectual consequences. In contrast, obviously, to the German and the American cases where racism sometimes described for a very long time. And even the British case, too, where much as in the United States, claims making on the basis of group difference, the Welsh, the Scots, the Irish, the Jamaicans, the Pakistanis, etc., has been very much a part of political culture, as obviously discrimination against same-sex groups. France has been different, though not because racializing hatred and persecution have not been abundant in the French past, obviously. This is the country of New World slavery and the Code Noir of colonialism, the Dreyfus Affair, Holocaust, collaborationism, and Europe's two biggest colonial wars in the 20th century. Though France is different because of the French Revolution and the Republican tradition that emerged from it. It did two things. As a revolution against privilege, it delegitimized claims making on the basis of group membership. As this famous lapidary phrase from the revolution, we must deny everything to the Jews as nation in the sense of a constituted body, and grant them everything as individuals. And that Republican principle was shaped the race question. And the revolution repudiated with the Declaration of the Rights of Man any form of segregation, of singling out citizens on the basis of race, religion, or origin. The strength of anti-racist currents and movements that came out of the Vichy experience deepened these convictions. So race as a concept is regarded as something that only exists in the mind of the racist. There's no positive, legitimate sort of sense of race as a category. This kind of historical tradition need not have inhibited the study of race in French historiography, but it did. And it was the Americans primarily who brought it onto the agenda. And now it's very much at the center of the conversation in France itself in historiography. So this is really similar in a certain way. Now this has happened for very different reasons, I understand, in the Russian case, but not completely. So the legacy of the French Revolution into Marxism and so on, there is a thread here. Now this kind of historiographical situation poses two important challenges. One is the temptation to further accentuate the notion of exceptionalism, and the other is to project one's categories from America or Britain, wherever you're writing from, into the Russian or French situation. And both of these papers do a really great job of meeting these challenges through two key maneuvers. One is to situate the Russian thinkers in their European context. Their thinking is happening through the mediation with conversations essentially mostly French and German race theorists. And the second is as you've here now witnessed, is very careful attention to vocabulary, its etymologies, the changing resonance over time through the work. So this is absolutely crucial, and both papers, I think, are very much in harmony with each other in revealing how variously, creatively, and ambivalently 19th century Russian thinkers thought about the relationship between nature and culture, biology and nature, biology and culture, and the overlapping of categories of tribe, ethnicity, nationality, and race in categorizing themes. There was a malleability, a flexibility, an instability in these concepts, and a blurring of them that was characteristic of the period. And this is not unique. Russia has lots of this in Europe generally, and there's a tremendous amount of this in the French case. And the person in particular who comes to mind is Ernst Renan, who's really important in the French conversation. And he was very much committed to culture as a category. And there's a certain kind of physical, biological dimension to it. It's not really strong. But he made culture functionally racist. That is, you can, as you said, you can harden culture to such a degree. And he did this in two really interesting different ways. One is his approach to categorizing human beings was essentially philological and linguistic. And he's very important in seeing language as determinative of human beings over centuries and millennia, and people are fixed in their civilizational hierarchy on the basis of their linguistic lineage. And then he played the same kind of game in the French case of using land and history, which are cultural categories in a certain way, as very hard sort of racially essentializing categories in response to the Alsace-Lorraine problem in France after 1870. He had to find a way of having German-speaking French people be as French as French can be. And he solved that problem through two moves. One was the notion of the nation as a daily plebiscite. It's a voluntary, so anybody who wants to be French can be French in a certain way. But it's a tie to the land and to a history, not to a racial lineage. But land and history is so hardly defined that it is functionally essentially the same thing. It is very difficult to have a connection to land and history if you're coming from so it seems to me, and this is an idea that just brought up to the conference, that the culture, race, the culture biology divide is not necessarily as important as the degree of essentializing any of these categories and the extent to which one uses them to hierarchicalize. You don't have to essentialize and you don't have to hierarchicalize because people are doing this redundance, and the question is why and how to do it. So I'm tempted to suggest that it's not as sexy as the title of the book, Race in Russia, but it might be conceptually more liberating to call it essentializing in Russia. No one will name a book like that. So racializing is a subcategory of essentialization, and the race category, which is a continual sticking point in the French case. If I'm with French colleagues and I use the word race, it still makes people nervous because it's not a legitimate category. But if you talk about essentializing and hierarchizing, we're having a conversation without any concept problem. Now, get back to these papers. I do have, there's something unresolved in my reading of them that I would love you to resolve for me. And that is the extent to which there were trends and drifts over the course of the 19th century in the way people were thinking about this. It's just, there is, I think I see in Vera Tolz's paper, essentially an argument to say that there wasn't, that this conceptual confusion was pretty much constant, and that's the point. And I see in Karl's paper something of an argument that there's a hardening of categories. There's an increasing commitment to, which is a more standard narrative in the European case. That by the end of the 19th century, the racializing of categories is getting stronger, but maybe not. And I'd like to see if you're both in full agreement on this or not. The other point is these are extremely erudite papers about thinkers in relationship to a conversation of ideas. These papers are not intended to address two, I think, really important questions of context. I'm not arguing that they should, but I think in the larger context of the conversation, there are two kinds of contexts that I think matter. One is the institutional situation that these thinkers are in and the political context in which they're responding. They're not just thinking in their studies. But I don't know. They are to some extent. There's a certain autonomy here that they definitely have, but there's a certain situation that they're in, and how much that matters. I mean, the second is to push that point further, which is what these papers are not intended to be about and shouldn't be about, but is crucial, is the mobilization of these ideas in the wider political context. That is, what consequences do these ideas have for people who really use race concepts to get things done, to ethnically cleanse or to organize education opportunity or whatever. And that becomes a really important part of the story in the late 19th century and 20th century, as opposed to the period you're dealing with here, but still that needs to be part of the equation. And I know I'm running out of time, but I'll make two other quick points. One is Jan Goldstein's presidential address last month at the AHR, the American Historical Association, was actually about mid-19th century French theorist of race. It was a really interesting paper, which has just come out in the journal, in which she takes Renan and Tocqueville and a couple of other people, and who are thinking about race, and she asks the question, what moral constraints are they operating under? That is, what is keeping them from becoming complete outright racists? What is keeping them committed to the racial conversation that will go in that direction someday, but hasn't yet? So what are the moral assumptions they're working with? And I'd kind of like to throw that question out here. For example, the extent to which the thinkers you're thinking about think about the consequences of their ideas. Is that constraining them, inspiring them? The extent to which they worry about the relationship between destiny and free will as a moral problem, is that thinking? The extent to which they are so taken by the promises of objectivity and science, so that the scientific dimension of their world is propelling them in really interesting ways that raise more questions for them. So and then finally, the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism against non-Europeans is really important in the French case. There's this continual, strange kind of conversation in the French case from the French Revolution, really before, certainly in the French Revolution, very much in the Dreyfus Affair, very much in the Vichy experience, very much in the Algerian War experience, and last month in the Charlie Hebdo experience. There's a continual conversation between non-European, how I want to characterize what we know, and the Jewish experience. And he's feeding across the contradictory, that's really important to the whole thing. And is that the case in Russia? The papers themselves don't really address this dynamic between anti-Semitism and the racializing of non-Europeans. But it's, I wonder. So that's, I've said a lot. I'll stop there.
So if you would like to respond to any of those, you can take a few minutes to do that. And anyone has questions, raise your hand and I'll be keeping them. Yeah, so first you can...
Thanks very much. It's really very thoughtful comments. Now, I think in most of our cases, I think these papers, I certainly, when I write mine, assume that many lawyers were Russianists, and they would have read both of us have written much longer sort of papers on the usage of the political race in Imperial Russia. And in particular, the first question, so I was trying not to repeat basically what I had already repeated, what I said before.
I wasn't.
Yeah. And the first issue you raised about trends, and that in my paper it kind of appears that it's all kind of the same discourse. And that's not my view. And in the kind of longer work I've written, is mostly about precisely kind of trying to give a chronology of the development of the concept. And what I'm arguing, something which Yanni later will take on in his presentation, I'm arguing that so if we look, not American cases separate, but if we look at continental European debates, in particular comparing in my earlier work, the Russian sort of uses of the concept of race with what happens in Britain, the kind of the chronology of development in Russia, kind of, or in Europe, maps onto the Russian case. And yes, we do have the kind of professionalization of the concepts of culture and nation starting in the 1870s, 1880s. And you have the same authors who make certain points in the 1860s, let's say in relation to Jews, understanding Jews as a religious kind of group and as a group with a separate culture, and if Jews only convert to Christianity, then they can become Russians. And in the 1880s, the same authors are saying that it's a different situation that easily. And also this debates about how the non-European, non-Russians, народцы, the special term in the imperial period, how we integrate them into the Russian Empire. So in the 1860s, up to the kind of late 1860s, this assimilation is looked at in benign terms, and in the 1870s, basically, the discussion is start to be related to basically Europe about the race, white race. Then this moral issue, yes, it is sort of present definitely in discussions of some Russian authors about race, and the American example comes up to criticize on the moral grounds. In relation to this institutional setting, I think Marina McGillner shows very well how the institutional setting matter in relation to anthropology. But I can't comment, let's say, whether there was, I don't have particular material to say, let's say, there is such a distinction among historians between those based in St. Petersburg and those based in Moscow, as you find in anthropology. And then anti-Semitism and general sort of political uses of the concept. I think, again, if you accept my comment that actually race and nationalist and narodность aren't that easily separated, and nationalist and narodность, these concepts can be used to perform the role very similar to the role performed by the category of race, then yes, there are clear political uses, and these ethnic cleansings which go on for Asia. And in relation to anti-Semitism, I think more and more scholars accept that at the turn of the 20th century, the racial understanding of Jewishness starts to impact policies, and that's particularly prevalent, I think, in the First World War, where clearly racial concepts are very overtly applied by military matters to the Jewish population, and also the deportation of Jews from border areas, western border areas, and this discourse around the deportation is basically the motivation to sort of how we define the Jew, 2 generations, 3 generations, so that's similar to my rules.
Well, you remember from last time we had this discussion, I invoked this imperial administrator on the eve of the Great War who referred to administratia, not upravlение, but administratia, as this nascent science which should be drawing upon biology and anthropology and ethnography and so forth, right? So wants to be, the practical science drawing upon these other sciences. I have to confess, the biggest shortcoming of what I've done here is that it's only discursive analysis. There's almost a complete lack of institutions. I've made some incremental improvements in this version, but that's still the fundamental flaw of this work here, is my daisy chains of discursive associations, but the lack of institutions. To take a concrete instance, I invoke a physician, natural historian named Lavietsky, justifiably unknown in the history of science. He has no accomplishments to his name. And yet, he is clearly a link between the practices of natural history and the institutionalization of certain kinds of new scientific practices within the training of physicians, right? So in the medical context. I can still, at this point, say very little about how that's going about. But that's part of this story, and the texts that I've had access to so far suggest that there's something more profound going on there than we've bothered to acknowledge previously. But as I also, and there's a visual component here that I haven't been able to address properly. The thick journals tend not, in the early years, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, tend not to have that many illustrations. Then there's the ethnographic genre. That might be another matter here, depending on who would ask for this. But in Lavietsky's case, there's some weird appropriation going on here, where he's completely he's drawing in the Hottentot Venus, as the concrete example that I gave in the paper, right? But it's bastardized, right? It's redrawn. It's not. It doesn't have any of the same pathological talk and sexuality associations that you find in Cuvier and Saint-Hilaire, right? All of that is screened out. And yet he still is using the textbook to advance a certain kind of naturalizing vocabulary. So, I come away from the exercise very dissatisfied with my ability to bring in institutions so far. And, well, there are moments of gestures towards politics, but that's precious little few and far between. I want to push back a little bit on the question of moral assumptions, though. Because we're edging close to, once again, talking about nature as the realm of destiny, culture as the realm of free will. And part of the issue here is that you have new scholarly practices which are coming into play, which we generally like to lump under the label objectivity, which are themselves moralized, okay? And in particular, in the 1820s and 30s, the new notions of mechanical objectivity, Gallison and Daston have written about this 800-page length, and I'll go take a look at that. But it's that moralization, there's no sort of deep contrast between the scientific practice over here and the moral consequences over here. The morals are being developed with the scientific practices. Perhaps not delineated very well in this paper, but I think that it's the processes by which what we would today call a scientific practice or some aspect of biologization, right? It's how that becomes epistemically credible that I think should be part of our purview. We don't just get to invoke that's the biologizing practice, right? And then the morals are over here. We have to somehow see how they're constituted together. That's what I see as a problem for our story. I don't think I'll try to speak to the issue of anti-Semitism or anything that I think keep us going in that respect. There's one other thread to take up here. Again, with the problem of nature as destiny. I think one of the reasons that you know, the usual tale that is told that goes back to the seminal work of Van Totus is that when Darwin is read in Russia, he's read without Malthus, right? The title of his book. And the Lamarckian notions of the inheritance of acquired characteristics somehow make it possible for many Russian natural historians and biologists to screen out the kind of hard readings of race. But the more I've looked at it, the more I've realized that there's not some prior background of Lamarckianism. Okay, I think that Lamarck is by and large, in the early days, the earliest references I found from the first decade of the 19th century, Lamarck is looked at rather dismissively, okay, by the Russians. And I think what happens is that he is reappropriated in the post-Darwin context to help push back against some of the problems of Darwin. But if you want to look at the immediate context prior to Darwin, look at the 1840s and 50s, the real debate is the Cuvier-Saint-Hilaire debate, right? And what's actually what's very sort of concrete here in terms of predecessors would be Bogdanov's own background, A.P. Bogdanov, right? He's not coming from the direction of Lamarck, he's coming from the direction of Saint-Hilaire. He's involved in a whole, if there's any mobilization, I suppose it comes in these attempts to develop akklimatization in the 1850s, right? Sort of the reinvention of the Linnaean cameralist discourse of the 18th century. Let's bring our plantains and citrus trees to the far north and acclimatize them, right? So environment along those lines, but not inheritance of acquired characteristics.
First question,
Yes, I very much appreciated Herrick's comments, and I wanted to pick up on one of them in particular and wonder what the speakers have to say. And also, I think we should all be reminded to move forward, which is the notion, in other words, that the work of essentializing can be done by something other than race. And the part when we're talking about race, we're trying to have a conversation about essentialism, which in Russia could take place in different form. So if you were to combine this with institutional questions as well, one could easily make the case, I think, anyone who's familiar with Imperial Russia, that if we're looking for essentialism, then look no further than the estate system, for example. If we're looking for essentialism, look no further than some of the ethnography that Nathaniel might have looked at in particular, the ways in which people are being categorized. And then looking forward in time. And here's where, this is something I really would like us to take seriously and to consider. Herrick is proposing also a different timeline and a different narrative, which is that although there are good reasons, and I think Nathaniel has been particularly good at this, there are good reasons why race will not work on an institutional level, particularly in certain periods of time, and it precludes the racial conversation, it still produces the essentializing conversation. And this would easily take us to nationality policy, the Soviet period in the 1930s in particular. And I think Eric had made the point in his writings, which I think was one of the first good conversations they had about race in the field. If those of you who do not know it, it was a forum in Slavic and Eric made the case that you can talk about nationality and be relieved that it's not about race, but in fact nationality is being treated as race. And so you begin to contemplate why is it that certain populations are being deported as suspect and treasonous as a population, as a nationality. Well, here it's hard not to think that this is doing the work of race, although not by name. So again, if I could pose the question again to the speakers, what would you make of this narrative? The narrative, in other words, of essentialism, and putting aside, at least temporarily, the nominal race.
I would say my paper is entirely all my kind of contribution. I thought precisely about that point that yes, народность, nationalist very much can play in particular circumstances the role of race. This was the same role as racial categories, and moreover, to our authors, it goes back to the 19th century discourse about what народность and nationalist is, with one author after another stating that actually народное, racial, and national are closely intertwined. And then this very important, the kind of the key concept which plays this role, essentializing role to me, is национальный character, which again is 19th century concept, national character. And it combines cultural features, moral features, and also kind of psychological makeup of the supposed group. And all these qualities are transmitted from generation to generation. That's sort of the common argument. And so to return to this, jump to the Soviet period, the debate in the Slavic Review, which is about the Soviet period, it's quite interesting that that, for instance, Weiner was also kind of arguing against Herrick's position, and he says that in the kind of Soviet, Russian context, it's sort of easier to escape your group identity because the characteristics are cultural. And he gives an example of the children of the kulaks who are allowed to live in the settlements. But what about, and in my paper I'm saying, but what about non-Russians? How is it easy or difficult for them to escape this extracted entity? And I give an example of Greeks and Crimean Tatars who were deported in 1944 from the Crimea, and they were not allowed back until Gorbachev's period, and even people born after the Second World War, but whose parents, grandparents were deported from the Crimea, they have a nationality of Greek or Tatar in their passports. They can't get a propiska residence permit in the Crimea, so they can't escape their group identity. So what I'm saying that in order to see how actually much the category of nationality is racialized, it would be interesting to look around the discourses. I don't know if anyone has done that, but surely there are archival documents, discourses around why the Crimean Tatars and Greeks are not allowed back after the war. What's the rationale?
Yeah.
I can't really speak to Narodnost in particular, but other than what little I had to say in the paper. But I want to actually shift to another earlier problem along a different axis, but which does speak to the problem of essentialization, I think. One of the things that might presumably distinguish Orthodox Christianity in its readings of the colonial race is its view of original sin, right? The curse of Ham is not such an issue for Orthodoxy because it denies Augustinian views of original sin. And yet, just very, very recently, I was running across a really fascinating figure who I get to learn more about, who taught at the Kiev Theological Academy in the 1830s and 40s, and lectured on the history of philosophy, on psychology in its philosophical sense of the day, and wrestles with this problem of human origins, of human difference, starts talking about the traits distinguishing the races for him, Plemian tribe, right? The races of mankind. How are they, okay, let me back up a second here. This takes place against a stronger sort of Linnaean background of concern about the chaos of the natural planet, okay, and how to impose some kind of taxonomic order on that, okay? And that includes people like Maximovich, who comes into play, who operates from that same set of assumptions, but remains very religious believer in the process. But how do you sustain difference over time without, if you take the possibilities of genealogy seriously, but you don't believe in original sin? So he wrestles with this. He talks about the ways in which every living being gives birth to another according to his image and his likeness, right? He's always playing on a biblical language here. Thus, you know, a Caucasian with a wife of the same race ought to give birth to a Caucasian, a Mongolian with one of the same race to a Mongolian, a Negro with a Negress to a Negro, etc. And this law quite stubbornly preserves its power if these representatives of races are transplanted to climates foreign to them as ascertained by experience of historians. And yet he talks about the ways in which we nonetheless see mixing take place, right? There are constant violations of this going on. And clearly some things are crossed and lost, others are retained in subsequent generations. That's what he wants to wrestle with. Well, how should this happen? And this forces him to circle back and talk again about the question of original sin. And then he creates a dual vocabulary, one that he can link to a strictly theological concept, and then another which he can talk about as a porcha, right, flaw, what's the word? Pardon, staining, yes, thank you, yeah, the notion of human stain, right? He tries to sort of dualize the notion of the human stain, physicalizing one half of that. So he's trying to both stay consistent with Orthodox theology and import other ways of essentializing which he thinks are consistent with his reading, and he seems to be unique in this respect, his reading of Kant's ontology. That's been the thing that's eluded me the most here, is that I really, really want to find Russian readers engaging Kant's ontology, and they're not there. But this guy is there, and I'm trying to understand how he's trying to make this distinction between natural description and natural history whole, right? And he does it in part with this semantic distinction of two different kinds of stain. So there are these subtle background efforts in play where even the most orthodox, in both senses, thinker is trying to bring in new discourses to reinvent the orthodox position, okay, in this scholarly context.
I would say the Orthodox Church was not against the concept of original sin in general. It was this debate about original sin is important in relation to one particular issue, which is the Odyssey. And there, the Orthodox Church followed Irenaeus rather than Augustine, but it's not that Orthodox Church in general, Orthodox Christianity, discards the concept of original sin.
Well, no, I mean, I'm shortcutting here, but there are certain, I mean, in terms of how the race discourses draw upon the notion of the sin of Ham and so forth, those various consequences that we can sometimes take for granted within a Catholic or Protestant context don't necessarily apply to the Orthodox. I'm just gesturing with that.
I want to make a comment first to Herrick and the organizers, and I want to say something about this question of essentializing, and then I have a specific question for the presenters. So first to Herrick and the organizers. I sense that the introduction suggests that Russia hasn't studied race, that it's new, that like in France, it's behind others. And I think this is really wrong. I mean, I think that while Eric's article elicited a great deal of debate around the Soviet period, there has been an enormous amount of study on issues related to the deep questions that we are considering, at least since the 1990s, and one could argue since the 1960s among Russian historians. And that's why you get all these brilliant paper givers here. So no need to apologize. There has been a lot of work on these topics, particularly in the Imperial period, I think, which has come out of the interest in empire. But to Herrick, I would say you're absolutely right. I work in both communities, and the French are behind. But there's a similar problem that both so-called national imperial historiographies share, and that is a kind of worry about the hegemony of American academic discourse. Do we really have to use those, American terms? Do we have to have these things? And here, well, Russians and French have different answers, but I'm not going to go into this. But I do think it brings up a question of the period we're looking at, and the fact that the period that most of these papers concern, 18th to 21st century, is one of the Western European imperial moment. And it's that context overall that is setting so much of the possibilities for argument of our subjects, not of our historical subjects. And I want to just caution people for a moment, even when thinking about such a question as essentializing, about the historical moment, maybe long, a couple of centuries, but one in which your questions about what's normal, what's moral, what's an exception, are all being generated in this broadly European imperial context. I mean, essentializing might be liberation. In fact, I think we could take this up in other papers. Essential qualities can be seen as possibilities. And probably for most of the world, for most of history, we did not share the assumption that essentializing is problematic. So that's just a kind of a caution to throw out the question about what essentializing racial or other categories could mean for societies. The question I have for the paper presenters is, I saw this more in Vera's paper, but in terms of tendency in the discourses, the multiple discourses, you mentioned these were late 19th century discourses, times in which people refer to the Turkic, the Mongol, the Finnic, and this kind of conglomeration of particular groups into big races. I wonder if you see this as happening sort of consistent between the two of you. Do you see that tendency, not as a tendency, but something that's ongoing? Or do you see it as something that develops over time? That is the sense of these family groups of races. I mean, we'll hear more about this later with the Yellow Peril and so on. But is this something late 19th century?
I think that certainly by the mid-19th century, you have a habitual sort of reference to these groups, and even earlier. And in the 1860s, these Finns, Mongols, Slavs are very often called races. Yeah. But basically systematic attempts to divide the imperial population into kind of discrete groups, and you have different kind of scholars and scientists working on that systematically. In the 1860s, that's the starting point. But you are absolutely right that the perception of essentializing as a problem is a quite recent Western perception, and again in Russia, in a mainstream dominant public discourse, there's absolutely still no problem to see with essentializing, and it's kind of post-imperial, post-colonial realization in the West. And so we are measuring things in this very different tradition against contemporary reform.
Well, I mean, I think that's why both of us and Nathaniel keep circling back to Sunderland's old paper on the Russians versus Nords, like this quite early concern that whatever Russians might be, maybe they're not staying Russians when they're interacting with these Inorods. So, and I think that's part of the thrust of my paper is not that there is that there's a well-settled set of discourses about differentiation and how to manage this or that other group, but rather that there is an ongoing concern with, just a second, have we lost track of how to stabilize the meaning of Russian as the imperial gaze? That seems to be very late line theory. That's not But for purposes of upravlение, right, I think that's later 19th century. I don't think that plays a role in the Armenian so much.
So next question. I think we're going to take a few questions and then
Thanks, really great papers. I enjoyed reading them. I guess mainly directed to Karl, but I think Vera will have some things to say as well. Well, first of all, I would really love to hear more about these comparative philologists, because I think they are an important piece of the picture, especially with the point that Jane just brought up about how these ideas of these larger conglomerations arise and the role of studying language plays into language as another sort of nexus of association. I was also very glad that you brought in theology as well, because I think we sort of tend to privilege the natural sciences as the lens in which we come at this, but there are other lenses as well, and I think the theological framework is very important in terms of the development of these discourses. So let's see about that up. The point I'd like to address has to do with this notion of the reading back this Boasian distinction between culture and nature, and I agree that these things have to be looked at in their historical context, and there's a danger of anachronism. At the same time, these dichotomies have their own prehistories as well. They're not coming out of nowhere, and there may have been related dichotomies in earlier periods, sort of ancestral dichotomies in a way, that also inform the way that these ideas are being treated at the time. So just because they're not talking about culture and nature doesn't mean it's a slate. And I'm particularly interested in the dichotomy between the spiritual and material, which goes back to Descartes, obviously, and particularly in the context of late 18th century, early 19th century philosophy. I mean, you mentioned Kantian philosophy and Schlegelian philosophy as well. Natur philosophy, obviously, the conceptualization of nature is a major part of that. But very different, contrasting ways of seeing nature. You see nature as the reflection of some kind of deeper spiritual reality that then manifests itself, and so that nature is the immanent expression of this deeper physical, this deeper spiritual reality, or do you assume that that's inaccessible, and all we can talk about is the material world and expressions in the material world, and this is a distinction that is fundamentally informing the work of these thinkers and the way in which they understand issues of human difference. And so I'm just kind of wondering what you're feeling. So maybe it's not fully realized relation in culture and nature, but there are distinctions that are being made at the time that inform these questions. And another distinction also, perhaps more related to Vera's notion, how we deal with this idea of narodness, is the idea of organic wholes, sort of totalities, as opposed to, I guess, like sort of determinism or something like that. In other words, when you talk about the essence of something, are you talking about the totality of the whole, or are you talking about one particular ingredient that makes it what it is? So, is your soup, borscht or solyanka, where it's everything all together, or is it chicken soup, where it's the one thing that makes it what it is? And these are also two different ways. I mean, perhaps a Linnaean way of looking at these things as opposed to I don't think more idealist looking at this totality of the whole. These are also different modes of understanding group identity, conceptualizing group identity, and the way that you place individual features, such as physical features, in the context of a larger group identity. I think these dichotomies are meaningful in these contexts, even though they're not saying nature and culture.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that if race is too tight an analytical sieve, that I fear that essentializing is too loose an analytical sieve. If our goal is to construe of the history of conceiving of human difference, to say that populations were essentialized doesn't tell me anything. However, when Vera Tolz tells me that in the Russian context, concepts of race, ethnicity, and nationality were gelling in a particular way, that does tell me something. So that's just, I wanted to sort of take a vote on that issue of essentialism. And I had a tiny question for Karl, and it's a very micro question, so if you'd rather not take it at this forum, but over coffee, I'm happy to do that. What does Sankovsky mean by globalization of travel narratives? Okay, thank you.
So one more question and then
I don't know whether this is a question or a comment. So I read Karl's paper as an illustration of something that I think is really the starting point for many of the papers. This workshop, that race was basically an idiom to discuss very broad range of issues pertaining to Russia's imperial identity, national identity, modernity, Russia's place in larger European context, and so on. And we can build, these genealogies of particular debates. We can think about this debate in terms of different kinds of oppositions, material, spiritual, race, culture, biology. But anyway, we will end up with either, again, repeating this idea that race was this very broad idiom, and it was becoming more and more kind of language of imperial self-reflection in Russia, or we will have to bring in, well, I'm not saying institutional dimension, but really kind of more narrow context and some kind of a story, because I think race is also a narrative. So this is not a scholarly concept, so to say, in most of the cases, except for maybe physical anthropology, people who really kind of define themselves as being representative of this particular discipline. Otherwise, race is always a narrative. Race is narrative, the generation is a narrative, so it requires a kind of a story. It's maybe biblical stories, maybe kind of fun, but it's a narrative. So, and we need either this narrative or a more precise historical context to understand a particular conversation that relies on these notions of race or narodность, the people, the tribe. And this brings us back to this issue of essentialization, which I absolutely agree with you that it's maybe too broad a concept to help us to understand the problem with the race comparatively. Because yes, if the Russian state, imperial state, and the Soviet state was an essentializing state, if the Russian imperial state operated with these essentialized notions of ethnicity and confession, and we know that in the imperial census, unlike Soviet censuses and post-Soviet censuses, nationality was not an option. People were registered by their confession and by their social state and by their language. And these notions, social state and confession, were understood in this essentializing term. So if this was an essentializing state, why this state resisted embracing race and nationality based on, say, idea of race as part of its official language? Why race, because of this resistance, became a kind of a concept endorsed by many opponents of either old regime or this imperial regime in the Russian Empire, which was actually the case, and why in the 20th century this state, or some pockets within the states, within the imperial state, they actually embraced race. The military ministry embraced race as an operational concept, but not, say, the Ministry of Education, and definitely not, the self-nationalizing imperial regime in the 20th century. So I think that we have to really think about this as an essentialization, again, comparatively, relatively, and we have to keep in mind this principle of imperial strategic relativism. Russian imperial regime was particularistic regime. Until the very end, this regime tended to treat nationality policies and peoples in terms of national questions, Jewish question, Muslim question. So this was this particularistic, if you wish, essentialization, while race, especially since the late 19th century, suggested a different logic, so suggested a kind of much more broad and universal conceptualization of groupness and different logics of elaborating state policies. So Imperial Russian regime remained this particularistic regime, and I'm using an MD phrasing and scholar here with this imperial strategic relativism, but this strategic relativism remained part of the imperial repertoire of power, which also explains that implicit usage of race in the Russian Empire. And just very briefly, and I think this is indeed something that is indeed very interesting and helps Russian historians not only to correct the perception of Russia vis-a-vis, histories of the West, but also to somehow influence the way race and history of empire is written from Western perspective, is to read Russian critique of essentialism as part of this Western intellectual paradigm, because in the Russian tradition you have actually very early critique of essentialism as a way of thinking about groupness and thinking about politics the Western way. Kind of something that precedes post-colonial critique. You have this in Russian intellectual tradition and scholarly tradition already in the mid-19th century, and then later on it became a really articulated, very post-colonial in contemporary terms, critique of essentialization, which is regarded as, exclusive Western quality.
So essentialization is an issue then?
Is definitely an issue, as well as this divide between biology and culture is an issue. It is discussed. It's discussed in very modern terms, in very kind of post-colonial terms. But I think that you have to problematize essentialization and place it back into its historical context instead of using this as a kind of analytical category explaining race and.
I think you're right. So this is an idiom. So our problem here isn't about do we know the details of our field? We do. We have a lot of specialists, and we can always respond to people from other fields and say, but I know this institution and you don't. What we're really trying to do here is to figure out where is the shared idiom and the shared set of concerns, the analytic levers, so we can have a conversation outside of our field as well. So as long as So as long as we have Slavic departments, we're fine because we don't have to talk to anyone else. As long as we have positions in Russian history, I feel fine, secure. But it's also nice and enriching also to speak with people outside of the way that Herrick was proposing, for example. So that the way that you narrated it is sort of by the end of it, you're saying, we actually do have something shared to talk about because essentialism is actually on the agenda in both cases. That's a good start.
Yes.
That's a good start.
Yeah, it's actually important sort of point Marina made, and we kind of should discuss this. That there were kind of ways other than sort of imposing racial and essentializing sort of models to capture human diversity in Russia. Daniel mentioned Karl, comparative philology, and it was underdeveloped in Russia, but comparative literature and the origin of comparative literature and actually theorizing around comparative literature, they are in Russian context, and one of the inventors of comparative literature as a discipline is Veselovsky, Alexander Veselovsky, and that's what kind of I discussed in my book on Russian law and Orient. And Veselovsky and the kind of new school of Orientology of Baron Rosen propose less essentializing way, and in a way kind of predating post-colonial discourse of understanding culture. And that's the turn of the late 19th, early 20th century. and their kind of interpretations are explicitly anti-racial. Some of them say that it's very unfortunate that the deterministic racial theories are kind of imposed on understanding of the European culture. And what they propose that is to see culture more as a kind of fluid category where practices are localized, they're specific to a particular time and place, and they also change when people interact with other people. And they sort of even kind of question group identity. So, well, you don't have sort of comparative philology in the Russian context, which does this racial work, or is underdeveloped in a way. But then you have this comparative literature tradition, which actually questions explicitly essentialization of culture and the use of racial theories at the time when, also within the Russian tradition, the hardest form of racialization are used as well. So it's very complex kind of picture. Anyway, I have other comments.
Well, just a footnote to what you were just saying. I mean, I haven't gone back and looked at Thomas de Husen's work, but I mean, the nexus between Steinthal and Petitnian, I think, could be important to what we're talking about here. And how Petitnian takes on board some ideas from Foucault's psychology, but not a. I haven't.
There's a very strong comparative philology school in Russia, going all the way back to the beginning of the 19th century. We have people like Rostokov and Kaladovich and these schools, and then someone like Muslaya, who's really understudied, but very, very much engaged in German discussion of philologists. So I would say it's underdeveloped.
Rostokov is reading the book, the Brown, so.
I believe he is.
So to me, it's kind of very Slavic-centric.
Yeah, that's my first impression.
Yeah,
well,
but I wouldn't want to pronounce it.
Anyway, I haven't looked at their work from the point of view of what we are discussing, but you're right, we should look at also kind of discussions about people with theological backgrounds. And it is to refer to chronology of how the concept of race sort of used differently with time. Kind of in my, again, kind of superficial reading, scholars with theological backgrounds start engaging the concept of race more later on at the turn of the 20th century, and in that sense, Astronomi's work is very interesting. It's early 20th century, and his work on Islam, where he does use Renan's work, and he uses racial concepts to understand Islam. But earlier critics of Islam from the Kazan Theological Academy, they don't engage with racial theory, so it's a basis from the 20th century. But also to answer Nathaniel's comment about Narodnists being a kind of group identity which is defined by a totality of attributes. It is very true, and sort of prirodne, or something which is cut from nature, will be part of a kind of larger conglomerate of attributes. But we should also remember that in 19th century race, it's also a totality of attributes. It's not just biology. It's very clear that race is defined through biological characteristics, but also culture and moral characteristics. So race is probably a smaller pool of characteristics, but it's not deterministic. It's not one in the 19th century. It's a kind of fluid group identity where biology is linked to morality and culture.
I'll say it later. So I want to address this very exciting and productive question about what is the difference between essentialism and racism, decentralizing and racializing. I think very interesting concerns going on. And I just want to raise a kind of other radical extreme for understanding the connection. And it's actually given by Karl, who wrote The Force of Prejudice, and he actually considers all forms of essentialism as racism, to such an extent that he
So it's very ahistoric, right? But it seems to me that one place to start to make the distinction is epistemological. And so I want to address a question to Karl. When you mentioned that there's this very trendy term, and I wonder why you call it trendy, called historical epistemology, it seems to me that's the place to start looking for the distinction between essentialism and racism. Because it seems to me that there are certain, and Nathaniel also mentions these kind of dichotomies and prehistory of dichotomies, and then Karl also mentioned the mutual constitution of opposites, such as nature and culture, free will, predestination, or predeterminism. None of these concepts can exist by itself. It needs its opposite to live. And so when does it become very important to think of nature culture, biology culture, and how do these dichotomies transform themselves? It seems to me there's a point in historical way to understand race as opposed to essence. So I guess it's a question for Karl. Why do you find it trendy? Is it do you think it kind of will live for stay for a while and possibly this idea of historical epistemology as a research approach?
We'll take a few questions, I think, before, unless you want. Okay, Eric,
excuse me. I mean, the more I listen to the conversation and read these very, very interesting papers, the less I am convinced that we're dealing with any exceptionalisms whatsoever. I mean, all the mobility of the word and the concept race and the racial practices, I mean, I think you would see in any Western language, history in the 19th century. People, nation, race. I mean, in English governmental documents, I think you would see them use the same terms. I mean, nation, race. The words bleed into one another very, very easily. You know, much as the way both of you have described the what was your term? It was a great term, terminological disarray. I think you would find that terminological disarray everywhere. I think it speaks to, again, the mobility of the notion of race, which then gets us into this very interesting discussion about essentializations and race. And here, I'm not sure that we have adequately distinguished the analytical categories that we, as scholars, bring to these histories and these particular thinkers, and the words and the terms that the various actors themselves use. And again, this would apply all across the board. I mean, the very, very long chapter in the Geschichtliche Grundbegriffe is titled Volk, Nation, Rasse, people, nation, race. You know, it goes back to antiquity to analyze those terms, but obviously they saw that in writing in the 1980s that drawing, it was not easy. And it never is easy to draw hard and fast distinctions between these words.
Yeah, and I've had moments of discomfort when I thought I was simply recapitulating for the Russian case the kind of exercise that Hannaford did with the history of race since ancient Greece, where you find race everywhere. I mean, that's a little worrisome. But let me circle back to Nathaniel's questions, because they're quite relevant here. Yes, part of the thrust of the paper was to say that there's no sort of inflection point where we pass from pre-modern to modern concept of race, from the moment of Boasian, the moment of pre-Boasian innocence to the moment of Boasian knowingness about some nature-culture divide. No, there is no inflection point. And you're quite right to insist that there are other kinds of functional dichotomies that are in play earlier that don't necessarily map easily to nature versus culture. Certainly, mechanism versus vitalism is crucial here. But again, the thing, this is why we need a proper historian of the life sciences in this room. And just meta-comment here. It's not just that we, as area studies people, need to be meta-interdisciplinary, right? This is, the race problem is also a problem of the history of science, and I'm a little bit nervous that I'm playing the role here of the representative of the history of science. I'm not quite qualified for the task. But materialism versus vitalism, part of what's interesting here is, of course, that Kant, and to some extent Buffon, it's not that Buffon simply picks up on Kant, but they both contribute to a conceptualization of race that is more genealogical rather than morphological, as it had been in Linnaean terms. But what happens is that Blumenbach sort of mediates between the two. Philip Sloan made an argument back in the 1970s that Blumenbach had basically been drawn away from the morphological by his reading of Kant and sort of gone full-on genealogical. Tim Lenoir pushed back 2 years later and said, no, there's an interesting way in which we have a tradition that is coming into play. It's at that moment that he liked to call vital materialism, which is something that actually culminates in the work of Karl von Vera, right? Who doesn't come on the mechanism side of things, and therefore wouldn't map easily to a here's the science trajectory, here's the spirit, culture, trajectory, right? He's very much on the vitalist side of things. So you're quite right that we have to historicize our convenient analytic dichotomies, which is in part what I was trying to do, and I guess part of what I have to do, if this is going to be a digestible paper, is to make clear what those earlier dichotomies for my actors might have been, if they're not nature versus culture. Material versus spiritual, absolutely wrong here. Most of the people that we're talking about think of themselves as more idealists, not, fine. 1860s, PCF, and so forth, the review book, you'll start having some full-on materialists, if you will. Earlier stage, they all think of themselves in dualist terms and often come down on the idealist side of things. That said, particularly when I look at somebody like this Kiev theological figure I just invoked a little bit earlier, the whole point is that they're reworking idealism. They're creating other forms of vital materialism, right? They're trying to infuse old forms of idealism with new content, trying to move the boundaries of body versus soul. And a problem that I haven't addressed properly, even in the earlier version that tried to go all the way up to the Soviet period, is that of the psyche. Right? We just assume an easy distinction between spirit and matter, but what is, I think, deeply problematic by the time, and you get hints of this from Marina's work, right, is that the study of psyche itself is being scientized to such a degree that you then have people to start worrying about distinctions between soul and psyche, and trying to systematize that distinction. So you get almost a triune system in some respects. And so you have to trace that as well. But in this earlier stage, it's more a question of whether the way that you talk about psychology, in a Herbartian sense, not in that later experimental psychology sense, right, can be invested with a set of meanings that is quasi-naturalized, but not necessarily material. Okay? And it's following those shifts that I'm partly trying to do. Let's see. Gogolization, guilty as charged. That's another one of those, oh, it looked great, and I sort of opened up the thread and never brought it back home, right? But it is about this problem of synecdoche, right? Using one visual marker and then generalizing and saying this stands in for, okay? And this is why I invoked Budinsky, because he has a way of rereading. Gogol might not himself have tried to naturalize. Okay? It's mostly Budinsky who naturalizes Gogol. But the point is, since so many people read Gogol through Budinsky's eyes, then this has this performs a certain function. And I think Sinkowski is sort of calling him on that. But again, that's Sinkowski's challenge of a certain set of realist assumptions about the relationship among the different znания, right, the different forms of knowledge, where he's not willing to grant any primacy to a zoologist over a philologist, etc., right?
Very cognizant that there is nothing, after our discussion, is nothing exceptional about Russia. But I think the kind of the framework of exceptionalism is very unproductive in the studying Russian intellectual history. And even in a way, sort of even Soviet politics, which is a more different case, but we study very policies elsewhere. West, but yeah, for intellectual history, conceptualism is unproductive, but you have specific kind of specificities in various different contexts. Yeah, the British case, let's say if we return to race, how race was understood in the British context would be different from French, and of course, American case where race has become the main unit of accounting for human diversity is specific in its own way, but again, we won't have this importance of race in American context. You won't find it in Europe, even in Britain, where the Russians constantly juxtapose their own approach to race to that of the British. But in Britain itself, even though race is kind of plays an important role in the context of India, in Britain itself, it's class, it's not race. It's the main unit of social differentiation.
But I think one has to be careful. Sure, there are all these specificities, but the Greek, the British in the 1820s and 1830s talked about a Greek race, where they try to figure out what to do with the Greek uprising against Ottoman domination. So there are always specificities, but I think one has to be careful not to make these too broad and fast. People know that language is present in British discourse, it's present in German discourse.
From a comparative perspective, from the perspective of US history in particular, I want to weigh in on this sort of debate over essentialism. The notion of intersectionality is a really big deal in American studies. So race, not just as theory, but race as it is lived, is considered to have been mediated by a lot of other essentializing categories, such as gender and class. And gender in particular, of course, is subject to the same binaries, right? Historically, it has been the nature versus culture, not just in the West, but in various non-Western societies. Of course, West itself, we won't go there. Because I think of the how different maps look, depending on where you've gone to school, right? So the point, in other words, race can be gendered, as a lot of US historians have pointed out, and gender can be racialized. And the implications of this, of course, is we can deal with these issues at the level of, and we should, historicize epistemological categories and so on for organizing and understanding these things. But then, for social historians, what these categories actually meant in the lives of people, that too is an important question. And that, I think, is where some of these specificities come. And we can talk about this later, again, as a US historian, but also as someone who grew up in India when it was allied with the Soviet Union in a completely non-allied sort of way. And when the Soviet Union was making all these overtures to Afro-Asian students, I'm particularly interested in the meaning of black. I mean, is there such a word in Soviet, and how do you translate it from one language to another? How did the Soviets translate it from one language to another? What did it actually mean in the course of Soviet history? Actually Russian and then Soviet history, because I've come across some interesting cases of, say, Afro-Caribbean immigrants to the US who came here via Russia, Imperial Russia, and they had rather different experiences in Russia than they did in the United States. But that is my particular area of interest. I'm especially interested in people back in descent and how the whole concept of blackness was conceived and historicized and theorized in Russia.
Well, you haven't started this argument. Let me say a couple of things. There are really two words that I want to emphasize. One is essentializing, the other was hierarchizing. Because you can, I agree with you, Jane, that essentializing isn't necessarily a debilitating thing. It's also the basis of which the generation defines itself. So, saying more César and so on, the French case for the language used. And then they thought about how essentialized should this be. But essentializing can be very powerful. You can't even get through the, I mean, we can banalize this. You can't get through the day without essentializing. You know, when you construct a category. I go to the barber and having a certain set of expectations of that's what we like based on my essentializing this experience. So there's that. But what I think what I've witnessed in this conversation is the utility of placing the race concept in a larger context. That's really what I'm arguing for, so that there's a basis of comparison. There's a way in which the cultural, what's so interesting to me about the papers and the conversation that it has triggered is the extent to which the processes of racializing, or functional racialization, can be built so much around culture, and not just around biology, phenotype, and so on, and can have devastating consequences. I mean, I just came back from Cambodia last night, where race is not the issue, but the essentialization. I mean, most of the terrible crimes since 1945 have not been built around the racialization. Biologically, it's been around the racialization culture. The narcissism of small differences, the hunger, etc. So I think the historical problem that we face, and what the second point is we're embedded in this history ourselves, right? I mean, race is a troubling concept in our own culture. And it's become all the more difficult because of DNA and all of that. I mean, the conversation about the relationship between culture and physical lineage is alive in our... So we are bringing to this our own very subjective position in relationship to these same questions. So that's why they're so interesting. And I think it's become, I think, urgent to broaden the conversation. The reason why I'm urging the essentializing and hierarchizing is that I think that we're living in a time where the race problem is taking different forms. And that has a history. We're part of that history. And so the Russian experience speaks to me, not only as a French historian, but just as somebody living in our own time, is extremely relevant to this longer history of how people use categories to control and so on. The third point I'll make is this is there is in the papers. Well, I'll just be more straightforward. I do think the racialization of class categories is really interesting in the Russian experience. I mean, the Iraq and so on. So I go back to my French experience and think about, well, okay, French history. There is a really interesting paper that just about to be published this spring, which looks at the use of racializing categories in the French Revolution of 1848, and reveals the extent to which the characterization of the insurgents in the June days were racial categories. They were described as barbarians, as cannibals, as people like the tribes of the Wild West in America. There was an appropriation of racial language to characterize the French, white insurgents of America as Paris. And the army that was used to assault the barricades was an army fresh out of the experience of the Algerian conquest. And they were led by the generals of the Algerian conquest. And they themselves liked to think that they were doing the work in Paris that they had been doing in Algeria. So okay, that's interesting. But it's a way in which this colonial context is shaping the conversation in France about class and about politics and about insurgents, not about even nationality groups. So again, when you think about hierarchizing and essentializing, you open yourself up to observing the ways languages of essentializing in one context, which may be explicitly racial and physical, are being appropriated for use in other contexts, and the way in which the culture concept can be so hardened as to functionally work as race. And I think the Russian experience is extremely relevant for that conversation, for people who work in other societies. That's sort of what I'm arguing for. I don't think that it needs to be a sieve so wide if you follow it with a paragraph that explains what, it's not, I mean, all essentializing in all contexts, and that is becomes sort of useless. But it's the way in a historical context of the 19th and 20th century, the experience with race and physics and biology creates discourses that get appropriated and reinforce discourses in other words. That I find interesting in the Russian case is perfect.
Yeah, I wanted to just kind of chime in and respond to some of your questions and points, Jane, and I think that they address some of the themes that have come up in the rest of the discussion. So it's true that in the Russian field, it's not as if people haven't been thinking about these questions about the category of race, about biological difference, and how Russians historically have viewed it. Right? Lewis Sunderland's article is a good example, and Yuri Sloskin is writing about it in the 1990s. And so one doesn't want to set up, right, the premise of this workshop was that this is a question that hasn't received ample, sufficient attention. One doesn't want to set up a straw man and say nobody's ever talked about it before, because that's obviously not true and not helpful. But the fact is, and I think this came up for me, right, in the Slavic Review articles, where Eric White's basically read, the latest batch of the historiography on the early Soviet period, and said, coming from the German field, said, you guys are talking about this phenomenon, but not using this category, which, if used, would give you a way of sort of describing the phenomena that you're describing in a way that would allow for comparison with other places that otherwise not using that category doesn't preclude. And it seems to me that whether or not people have been writing about biological factors of human difference before the Slavic Review article is at a certain point almost beside the point, because, and you can see this in the responses to the article, it was, no, that's not what we're talking about. And there is a resistance to using this category in Russian historiography. I'm sorry, except for sorry, with this important, with some of the responses, right? And so, but this is a debate. The point is that this is precisely the debate that's ensued, and so it seems to me that the question, there are at least two goals here, and the papers in this panel were dealing with. One question is how to recover the language that's used in Russian history that is racializing language, whether tribe or race itself, which we've seen is being used quite ubiquitously. And that's one question, the kind of terminological question, is trying to actually demonstrate that this isn't strictly an imposition of a Western category on the Russian experience. These are Russians for the last 250 50 years drawing on this broader global discourse. And that's one, the kind of terminological question. The other question is how the Russian field can use race as an analytical lens for describing practices and phenomena in Russian history and literature and so on that without that category would be less visible or not as easy to see. And that's, I mean, gets at this question of how do these discourses connect to institutionalization, how are people deploying the category of race for one end or another, and it might be emancipatory, and it might be pernicious, and one can find both phenomena, right, and not only in the Russian case, and here this compares to other places. So, I mean, I think it's an important point to say it's not productive to cast the baby out with the bathwater and say, you know, this is somehow brand new. But I think that it's also the case that for one reason or another, a large section of the field has been resistant to thinking in these terms, and that needs to be explained. Now, it's a debate to be had. It's not an answered question, but that's part of I think the premise. Sorry.
There's a reason, I think, picking up on, does someone else have a question?
No.
There's a reason why I think picking up on what they were saying, that we're talking about it as a discourse, right? Now, it's a term that we use, but it has uses in this regard. Because what we're saying is that there's a conversation going on, but we don't necessarily decide in advance where it's going to take us, per se. And there's a difference there. And I think part of what Herrick and Herrick have been telling us is that they, that there's similar determinism going on in every other field too. I mean, there's nothing unique about the Russian case in that regard. So we should be perfectly content to say that it's confusing and there's terminological confusion, but that doesn't make it in any way unique. In terms of how it manifests itself differently, so here's picking up on the question that you asked about students and about Africans coming to Russia, particularly in the Soviet period. There is this new historiography, and it's a very good one. A dissertation was just defended in Paris on African students, and there's a colleague of Nathaniel's who also works on African relations with, including Africans moving back and forth, and there's more and more of this going on. And it's a very good historiography, and so one of the first steps was to point out something which was surprising to some, which is that being an African in the Soviet Union did not free you of racism. Right? So for some it was a surprise, and we needed to hear this. And we had a conference here, I think it was last year, with Africa House, precisely on this issue of Africa, Soviet Union. Anne Lounsbury, by the way, has written on blackness in Pushkin, and understandings of Pushkin over the decades, which is another dimension to the same question. So when it came to the African students, here was this paradoxical situation where the students come over and they're told, we're not going to treat you as a race. Okay. Now, the African students were more savvy than anyone could imagine because they said, well, you know, okay, you are going to be racist because we're used to this. That's what we're used to. And we don't have to come to the Soviet Union to experience racism. We can go anywhere else into the front. But we're curious about how it's different here. Which is, very savvy. And some of the participants in the conference, by the way, were graduates from Uganda and Nigeria from Blumenbach University. Right? And they were listening to, in this case, it was European historians saying, it's just terrible, they're racist. And they said, what do you think they're going to be? I mean, how naive can you be? So, and they said, well, you must have really suffered there. They said, well, no, we can suffer in New York, we can suffer in Paris, and they said, well, what was important for us? What was important for us? And this is where we're getting to this question, really. What was important to us is that when we went to parties, and the other students told us that we cannot dance with the Russian women, the KGB came in, closed them down, arrested them, and expelled them from the university. Now, that wouldn't happen here, right? And I wonder, so on the one hand, I feel very gratified about this, and I say, well, thank God, there's someone stepped in to do the right thing, for a change. On the other hand, did even the KGB believe it, right? So here's an institutional question. You know, you're not allowed to be a racist, publicly.
Well, I just want to make one comment. Responding to David, yes, my comments are not, I'm all for talking about across borders and having more global history. But I don't know if anyone here in the audience was at NYU last Tuesday when Jean-Philippe Chaud spoke to the Center for Latin American Studies. And his problematic, this is to show Harvard, yeah, it's right there. His problematic was basically talking about 15th, 16th century Iberian state, and to demonstrate the essentialization of blood descent characteristics in Jews, just before the expulsions and after. And so to do this, Herrick, if you haven't heard about this, he started with you. He said, I want to show that you can have racism without explicit use of the category race. So I think this is very important for what we're doing today. It's a similar argument. And he then proceeded not just to cite the controversy that your article started, but also to take citations, and this, we must say, was rather tough in the Latin American studies context. Citations from Lenin and Stalin, but especially Lenin, and early others, Lunacharsky and so on. That was language that anyone in the audience would recognize as racial descent type language about, people who were enemies and so on. So he used our field to speak back to Iberia and pre-American, basically, it's trying to say pre-Atlantic slave trade kind of racist constructions. But he used this very heuristically. He used our field, not to say that anybody was reading, Lenin and Stalin, but really that you could have a situation in which a language of descent, bloodline descent, was accepted the dominant political discourse, even when the explicit category used was not race. So anyway, I'm happy to see that everybody here is engaged in this, and we've already made an impact.
Well, I could just add to what Jane was saying, an additional feature of the, not comparison, but the heuristic discussion was, in both cases, that you're talking about empires organized around a universalist discourse, Catholicism, 15th, 16th century Catholicism, and socialism, which nonetheless then are racializing and excluding certain groups through their racialization.
It's also one addition. I was just, what Yanni was saying about black students in the 60s, and there's a lady actually in New York, Yanni who's making a film at the moment about black Russian experience. It's called about the immigration of blacks in the Soviet Union, mainly from America, mainly from the Harlem Renaissance circles in the 1930s, and she interviewed a lot of their descendants. And their experience was one which I would actually say, of course, in a certain way, is also racism. They were elevated to this the status of the exotic, and but they were saying we could have any girl we wanted because we were so high in the sort of social strata as a sort of special guest of the Soviet Union that. And I was first very skeptical, but she had shown me these interviews, and certainly the families of these descendants felt very privileged. And again, that's sort of something where, of course, they don't use the category of racism because it has a negative connotation, but of course they're singling out as sort of black example. And of course, in the terms of the black immigration, the category of race was very much employed, not self-employed to the Soviet Union, but employed as something which made these people emigrate from the States because they were suffering under racism. So the category was there, it was just there somewhere else, not over here. But of course, the sort of singling out in the Soviet Union is a form of racism itself. It's just a sort of exoticism. And again, I mean, I found it interesting what you were saying about how other categories linked link into it. But I'm not a specialist on this, I'm just basically telling a second hand that this is something which is being made at the moment, and it's interesting to see how the experience of this early wave of immigration differs from the students coming in the 50s and 60s and coming, of course, in much larger numbers.
But here, I think the privilege comes not from the fact that they're black or
well, it's sort of
privilege
plus,
comes from, or exotic, the privilege comes from the fact that they are iностranцы, that they are foreigners.
But if they were white Americans, they would have a different. They come as the persecuted minority of America. They come to show that the Soviet Union is better than the US in receiving.
But they appeal at the level of the kind of population-wise, they appeal to women. I doubt it's that. It's the fact that they're foreigners.
Yeah, but it's funny how they perceive it as that they appeal because they look different and they are the sort of people who have suffered somewhere else. So I'm sure, and I think this is sort of what I came to in my discussions with the filmmakers, that there's a certain disconnect of what they think they're witnessing and what de facto, or what not de facto, but what, I mean, there's a certain disconnect of the subjectivity of the immigrants and the subjectivity of the people who encounter these immigrants.
There's a John Scott has this line about gender, which is gender is never about gender, it's always gender and something else. I think one can say the same thing about any category, but certainly race. And what this reminds me of is the experience of African Americans in France in the First World War and then after World War II, and where their experience, the way many French people treated African Americans in both contexts was explicitly differentiated from the way Africans were treated in France. So that the African American was regarded as coming from a higher civilization. They were sophisticated in certain ways, and there was a lot of appeal in many ways that was being explicitly denied to Africans or even from Britain. So the differentiation of blackness was highly sophisticated game that being played in society came out of history. The other remark I'd make is sort of goes back to something else, which is looking for a history of discourses of counter-essentializing or of anti-racism or anti-anti-Semitism. And the historical specificities of that, which is not something that we're really addressing so much here, but I think is important, the way in which, so for example, in the French case, there was a discourse, it's small, very, very small, it was there in the 1840s, partly through abolitionism, but even coming from other sources that explicitly rejected the hierarchization of civilization, explicitly argued for the equivalent of African civilization and civilization. It was rare, but it existed. It was thinkable in the 19th century. And so there is a history that develops out of that, of sort of rejecting dominant discourses of essentializing. And so I don't know what that history looks like in Russia, and what the Russian context does.
Russian Eurasian is actually built on precisely this theory and developed within their Eurasian discourse.
Okay, good. So, but I think that's part of the conversation.
But the biggest comment is communism. Right? I mean, it's all structured around the notion that you cannot differentiate existence. The entire Soviet Union is structured around this.
Right, but it raises the same question as the French Republicans, which is, a discourse is absolutely committed from the get-go to reject forms, to reject inequalities, but builds into it other inequalities and never really quite does its job. And there obviously is there's a genealogical connection between communism and republicans.
What you also have is that you can have a particularly very well sometimes official discourse, kind of 1920s Bolshevik official line that which rejects hierarchies and hierarchical view of the world and basically adopts post-colonial rhetoric. forget the kind of prejudices and perception that ultimately, in fact, look at the reality, and everything is hierarchical, is very, very deeply ingrained. And so we have a paper, interesting paper about Roma. So you have this kind of official discourse of equality, but at the same time, very same time, the term backwardness is used also as an official term, and people at all levels, including activists themselves, they're deeply influenced by basically everything kind of this is a stereotyping.
Yeah, the discussion has moved on a little bit. I wanted to make 2 comments. Since I will also be speaking about African students in the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s tomorrow, where I've noticed in looking at some materials in the Institute of African Studies that was founded pretty much at the same time as the admission and recruitment of students from the so-called developed world began in the Soviet Union, where racism is definitely present, but it's always diagnosed over there. And that actually reminds me a lot of what both Vera and Karl were writing about as having a race and racism is diagnosed somewhere else, not within Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. But what I found interesting is that their racism in the 60s and 70s was always very specifically related to colonialism and imperialism. So really talked about as something that's very functional, that plays a certain role. And I think that's in some ways what we are doing here. When we try to talk about the concept of race, award, leukemia, and tremendous, we talk about how they function. And so I'm actually wondering whether we actually need a category of race, rather than working with kind of some of the analysis of the functionality of racial categories in racism. For example, that would be more productive to trying to see whether race has been used as a category or not. And that's where notions of essentialism and hierarchism, I think, become very, very important. But in that sense, I think that's an analysis in the world must work just fine. So.
I'll be commenting on it if I loved it. I can talk much more about it.
Yeah, but I think, and I'll be talking about that tomorrow, but where it also was very, very clear that the Soviet state, the Soviet government had a commitment. They were trying to do something better. They were trying to overcome racism. And framing of internationalism there was very, very important, which I actually think should be included into the conversation of racism in the Soviet Union. But where at the same time, Soviet citizens were not necessarily happy about uniform students, but not necessarily because they were different because they were black, but because they had a privilege that Soviet students like some didn't have. It was much more economic animosity in some ways that played a role in
Last question,
It wasn't so much a question as just offer up another example of black communism interaction, which is about the 400 kids, SWAPO kids of orphans from the Southwest African People's Organization. They were either orphans or their parents were in South African jails in the 1970s and 80s, who were taken in by the German Democratic Republic. Again, this official discourse of internationalism. And in some ways were privileged, in some ways were very well treated, but were also kept in their own kindergartens, own schools, own living quarters, separate from the rest of the GDR population. My first encounter was this when I was in the archives in Namibia, and a black woman comes in speaking flawless, unaccented German. And I went up and talked to her. I'd heard a little bit about this, but she was one of those kids. And then after the wall came down, they were basically unwanted in unified Germany. The same was true of Mozambican and Vietnamese workers who were in the German Democratic Republic. And then they were repatriated about 1992, but it's pretty much a sad story, the repatriation of people between two worlds. They grew up speaking German, not any of the indigenous languages, no Afrikaans or English, two official languages in Namibia today. but it was another one of these very, very interesting encounters.
Final word from either of the panelists?
Just a short footnote to what Trina was saying earlier. I mean, about a dozen years ago, Annika Willow wrote this very provocative article about class instinct, category of analysis. So I think it's following up. She only looked at canonical writing and design and his immediate circles, but there's a lot of context for the ways in which instinct is being used in this period that needs to be pursued. Right? It doesn't look like an obfuscation category, but it certainly is a naturalizing one that is being killed in interesting ways.
Yeah, just briefly, I think we, after already the first panel, you can see that race is something to do with this umbrella concept, that it's thought, it's a narrative, it's a practice, official practice, practice of the ground. And I think when we study something as broad as this, we need to ask very clear questions and find appropriate tools to answer those questions. And we can generalize at the same time, looking at very specific kinds of context is actually very productive. And before we start generalizing, we should have more of very specific case studies, and we will have further such discussions in relation to specific cases in this workshop.
I think that's a perfect segue to our lunch break and getting ready for the afternoon of panels. Everybody is welcome to go next door to room 222 right here and feast. And then we'll reconvene at programs, but we'll reconvene at 1:20 and start the next panel at 1:30. Let's get started.